Welcome back, everybody, to the Innovative Agency. Sharon Toerek here with you today again, and I am really excited about today's discussion. I don't always get a guest whose content and whose area of expertise is as relevant to me as it is to all of you. And so this is kind of a twofer for Sharon for today. So I'm feeling really good from a selfish point of view. Jonathan, I'm looking forward to getting into this with you. Thank you for joining me, Jonathan Stark.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
So, to level set here for everybody listening, Jonathan's expertise doesn't come via the pathway of having been an agency owner or being a marketer necessarily, but what Jonathan's an expert in is the way you think about capturing value for the work that you do for your clients, and specifically he's on a pathway towards eliminating selling your time and billing by minutes and hours and blocks of time. And so I guess I have so many questions for you, Jonathan, but let's start here.
Sure.
What made you passionate about this topic? Because you have a background that is tech oriented. There's a lot of things that you've developed expertise in, and obviously this hit a nerve with you. So tell us a little
Yes.
bit about that first.
Sure. Back in 2003, I started working at a software development firm. And over the course of a couple of years, I worked my way up and I got into management. And when I hit that level, I was doing one-on-ones with the other developers. And that meant that I had to see what their salaries were because we were negotiating, like raises and things like that. And I realized that our best developers we were probably just barely breaking even on, and we were making tons of money on our most junior developers because the best developers were really expensive, let's say $100,000 at the time
Hmm.
for a salary for a top developer, and a junior developer would be making less than half that.
Right.
And we were billing them all out at the same hourly rate. And to make it worse, the really good developers did high quality work very quickly, so they didn't have as many billable hours for a given project as someone who was more junior would have. They bill way more hours and
Mhm.
they cost less. And I was like, no, this can't be right. We don't want to hire a bunch of juniors and keep them junior, not train them, not make them better. Just we want to hire the worst developers we can find. That didn't make sense to me. So I did all these gymnastics in my mind. I was like, well, the really good developers, they train the younger developers and they create documentation and they did all these things. And I'm like, no, all of that stuff's just going to make us faster. So we really should hire mediocre or worse developers who are slower and cheaper. And I could not stop chewing on that problem because that was obviously not the way that we had been running the business or wanted to run the business or even it wasn't even the work environment I wanted to be in.
Mm.
So I puzzled over that for weeks before it even occurred to me to question the business model or the billing model, I guess you'd say. And as soon as that happened, as soon as that shoe dropped, the heavens parted. I was like, oh, it's because we're trading time for money.
Mhm.
Because if we didn't do that, then instantly our best developers would be really profitable and we wouldn't want to hire a bunch of juniors and it would be expensive for us. It'd be a real investment for us to train them up, but we would at least benefit from it if the younger developers got better.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, okay. So hourly billing is nuts. And what was wild about that before I moved to the next step, what was wild about that was it took me weeks after working there for years to even question it, to even think that there might even be a different way to do it.
Mhm.
Everybody in our space billed by the hour is just a question of how much per hour. And yeah, and so I just couldn't unsee that. And I went to the boss and said, hey, I told him what I just told you. He said, I understand that intellectually, but what would we switch to? And I said, I have no idea, but I want to figure it out without risking everyone's payroll and mortgage payments and everything else. I didn't want to experiment on a business with a bunch of employees. So I went solo and immediately tried to find a different model.
And this is fascinating to me. So for the agency owners and leaders listening to this and who accept your premise, and I
Mhm.
believe, trust me, I'm a believer. I think for a lot of them, though,
Hmm.
this is a mindset issue of how to have the conversation with the clients
Hmm.
who have a legacy of expectation of knowing how long is this going to take you and how much time can I expect to have to pay for, and especially built into the enterprise procurement practices, right? If they serve like enterprise sized companies.
Sure.
So how does the agency owner or whoever's responsible for, for revenue at an
Hmm.
agency get past that mindset, if you will, to get the confidence of expressing value in
Hmm.
some other language or some other pricing model, I suppose,
Right.
when there's an entrenchment sort of it's always been done this way and it's expected to be done this
Yep.
way. And how do we confidently pitch ourselves with a different value proposition? So I guess I'll
Hmm.
leave it there. And I know that's a complex question, but I think that is a hang up for a lot of professional service companies. I know it is in the agency world.
Hmm. So there's a couple of things, there's several things going on there. One is that not every client is a good fit for not every buyer is a good fit for every seller. So there are some people that you're never going to change their mind. And there might even be situations where it's required that they have hourly rates so that they, satisfy some grant or something like that, or some
Right.
mandate from the government. So, but it's fine. It's, don't work with those people. There are people out there who have been lots of people, clients out there who have been burned so badly by hourly billing in the past that they would gladly go to some other model. And if you're dealing with the true economic buyer at some organization, someone who's responsible or maybe bonused based on their performance in
Hmm.
a revenue standpoint, they'd be very happy to give you to get a price. I mean, Sharon, think of anything in your life that you decide to buy without knowing how much it costs before you decide.
Right.
There's nothing. So it's not that we have to change the way that people think about purchasing in general, because basically everything they buy, they know the price first
Hmm.
and almost just find there's two, you can say reveal to them like, well, wouldn't you rather know how much it's going to cost before we start so that you
Yeah.
could decide whether or not to buy it? And if someone says no to that, then fine, maybe they're not a good fit, or maybe you're talking to the wrong person in the organization. You're
Hmm.
talking to procurement or someone at a low level, not the person who's actually going to benefit from the outcome that you're being hired to contribute to. So it's not an unusual thing to know a price before you make a purchase decision. It's like that's like 99% of the time the way things work
Hmm.
in the industry. But to your point, on the buyer side, the client side, they are expecting to get hourly rates from people.
Right.
That's what they're used to. That's what we're used to. Everyone's used to it.
Yeah.
So it's easy in that regard because it's no surprise. But what happens is when someone approaches you and says, "Hey, I heard great things from Alice. We'd love to work with you and at least talk about maybe working together. What's your hourly rate?" I would say, "Oh, I don't have one," and then just let that hang there until
Mm.
they say like, "Well, what do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'll give you a price for the project in advance so you know how much it'll be. Is that acceptable?" And everyone's going to say yes. If you're talking to the right person and they don't
Hmm.
have some, there's not some contingent, like I said before, it's
Mandate.
not
Yeah.
mandate that it has to be hours compared to hours compared to hours, which is a bad business. It's a bad business to be in if you're being compared apples to apples across your hourly rate.
Hmm.
So those are probably not good clients for many reasons.
Yeah. I think another part of the challenge that an agency leader has with this, and I suspect you have a point of view about this because I know you've talked about it, is okay, it's one hurdle to get over when you are dealing with legacy or client expectations in terms of how you express value. I think the other part of the equation for lots of agencies is how do we know what value slash price to set?
Hmm.
How are we confident that we are moving forward, expressing value appropriately to what's going to be exchanged? You know, we have margins we have
Hmm.
to maintain, we have costs that we've got to make sure we're fulfilling, all of that. And I think that is the other half of the mindset issue, probably that a
Hmm.
lot of people responsible for revenue at agencies are dealing with is we don't know what the right price is, or we don't know how to know what the right price is.
Yep.
So, what wisdom do you have for folks who struggle with that part of the equation?
Sure. So before I dive into that, I just want to zoom up a little bit for a
Yeah.
second. So there are different ways to price things. There are that are not hourly, that are like fixed prices or subscription pricing, or all of these things that are not hourly, not trading time for money. The specific one that we're talking about right now, and I'm going to jump back into, is project pricing based on the value.
Hmm.
Okay, so value-based pricing specifically is what I'm going to address here. It's not the only way, but
Hmm.
it is the way we're talking about, and it has extreme benefits. The way that you figure out the value, it's a perfect question. How do I figure out the value? And the answer is you have to talk to the client, find out what is the outcome that they're looking for, not the inputs, not the features, not the number of pages, not the lines of code, none of that. It's like, yes, you want a bunch of features. Yes, you want me to write a brief. Yes, you want a white paper. Yes, you want some number of marketing materials. I understand that that's how you're thinking of this thing that you're going to buy,
Hmm.
but why do you want them? Nobody ever paid me to write 100,000 lines of code so they could print it out and hang it on their wall. They don't want the code. They want the code to do something beneficial for their business. So
Hmm.
there's something that they usually don't even share with you just because they're not thinking that way. They say, here are the bunch of things we want you to do. Can you build this? Can you make a blue button? Can you put the logo over here? Can you do all these things? It's like, yeah, I can do all those things. But why do you want those things? Like, what is the point of those things? So basically, I go through what I would call the why conversation, which I originally found a version of in Value-Based Fees by Alan Weiss, very good book.
Hmm.
And you just ask why this, why now, and why me. So you get the person on the phone. They've agreed that you don't have an hourly rate and they still want to have a conversation with you. Okay, great. They tell you all of these things that they think they want you to do. It's like a self-diagnosis of a sort of pre-decided solution by the client who's not the expert at the thing anyway. So why would they decide what the solution is? But it's the way they communicate it to you. It's the way that they think about it. So here's a
Hmm.
bunch of things we want you to do. And I let them sort of brain dump all of that and get it out of their system for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And I take notes on it. And it can be useful in the future. It's not always, but it can be. And then once I feel like they've exhausted everything that they can think of about the project, I will say, this is great. I've got 5 pages of notes already. Can we back up a little bit? Because there are 100 different ways I could go about building these things for you.
Hmm.
And I need to know, it'll help me a lot and make good decisions along the way if you can tell me what all this stuff's for. Like, let's say it was done. We waved a magic wand, boom, it's done. What are you going to do next? What's the thing that you're hoping this is going to do for your business? And a good client will sit back, they'll love this question. They'll sit back and they're like, oh, so glad you asked me that, right? They'll say, what we're hoping is that we'll be able to create a moat around our existing business before Amazon comes into this space. So there's something happening. New regulation is coming down the pike, and they're like, we want to set ourselves up to capitalize on these new regulations. And there's maybe it's really urgent, and that's why we want to do it. And then I can start getting into the why conversation questions. So that maybe it's some sort of internal streamlining workflow solution that will allow the client manufacturer, maybe it's a manufacturer, and it's going to allow them to increase their productivity, improve output, something like that.
Hmm.
And I would say, okay, great. Why don't you just hire more people? It's like, yes, automation and software or whatever it is that you do, I'm sure you can extrapolate to your own space. It's like, why not do something cheaper? Why not do something safer, something you're already used to?
I love this. This is not the first time you've said this, and I have seen some of your other content, and I want you to expound on it. But I just want to
Hmm.
interrupt you for a second to say, I love the contrarian nature of this because it establishes authenticity in your interaction with the client, and it helps you demonstrate that you're genuinely interested in helping them solve their problem, not
Right.
just in generating revenue from the problem, to your bottom
Hmm.
line. So I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I love this line of reasoning and this line of questioning. So please proceed.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's good to hear. Basically you're trying to talk them out of working with you, and then they basically talk themselves into working with you.
Mhm.
And in the process, you find out what they're going to measure. What is the success metric? What is the needle that they're really trying to move with all of this code or pages or words or whatever,
Mhm.
all these inputs that they think they want you to do. And so you just keep going through the why conversation with genuine curiosity, because it's like a doctor. First, you want to first do no harm. You want to find out, you want to diagnose the situation before you start prescribing a therapy.
Mhm.
And it does project, like you're sensing, it projects this lack of desperation.
Right.
It's like, I don't need this. I'm not I'm doing the opposite of pitching you. I'm like anti-pitching you. Like,
Mhm.
isn't there a cheaper way to do this? Why do it this way? Why do it with software? Why do it with automation? Why do it with, manual labor? Why not just hire more people or do it with physical automation or what, all the other things? Why not outsource it? So, okay, maybe it does have to be software. Maybe it does have to be the kind of solution you're talking about. Why not? Why hire someone expensive like me? Don't you have
Mhm.
employees that could do this? Or couldn't you hire an employee to do this? It's probably going to be less than paying me. And all of these things, you basically bring up all of their objections that they might have to your eventual proposal in advance,
Mhm.
so you can find out from them why they want to hire someone expensive like you, why they need to do this right now. There's something very urgent happening, something either just changed or is about to change, and why they want to solve it in this particular way. And you all, and you and the buyer and the seller, you and the client, sort of come to an agreement. You sort of, as the seller, I sort of think of it like I'm their boss and they have to convince me to
Of why you should
to
work with them.
yeah, right. And it's like, why would I allow you to spend all this money to do this if I was your boss? Like, what would be the business case? I'm always looking for the business case.
Mhm.
So it's going to lead to something that they think is going to be very beneficial for the business. So this is a long way of answering your question from, probably 2 minutes ago. How do you know what the value is? You have to have this conversation with them. It's in them. It is not in you.
Mhm.
You can make some guesses, but that doesn't mean it's in there. It doesn't mean it's in the other person's head. It's a perception of value. It's a perception in their mind. It's totally subjective. So, but you can figure out ballpark, you can figure out close enough what it's probably worth to a person like this at a business like this at a time like this.
Do you need What kind of data points do you need in addition to what the potential client is disclosing in these discovery conversations about their business needs or their goals or whatever? What are some data points that you think sellers, in this case agency owners, but sellers of services might fail to ask for or might be missing? Because it's great to know our goal is to increase revenue or share of market by X
Hmm.
percentage or this many people or whatever. But you don't necessarily have the data at your fingertips. And so,
Yeah.
are there data points that you find it's helpful to have when you are analyzing what they're telling you about their goals, along with determining what it might be worth them
Hmm.
for you to sell them what you're going to sell them?
Right. So probably the easiest way to picture this, the easiest way for me to describe this so that you and your listeners can picture it, is that if I if I decide that I want to work with this client,
Hmm.
I'm going to write a proposal. And in that proposal, I want to write a compelling story about why they'd be nuts not to hire me.
Mm.
So, at my fee, let's just assume my fees are going to be twice as much as anybody else they talk to. So
Okay.
it needs to be a really compelling story. What's going to make that story really compelling is if it's a story they told me, I didn't prompt them or lead the witness, and there's numbers. They don't have to be dollars, but there's numbers. Because
Okay.
numbers are the language of business. If you get to the end of this conversation and you have no numbers about anything, you probably could have done you probably should keep practicing.
Got it.
But it could be something as obvious as this kind of thing used to happen to me all the time because I built internal systems, internal software systems,
Mhm.
which are meant to allow the existing employees to do more work faster and better.
Got it.
Okay, so increased productivity type of things.
Mhm.
And one of the why questions that I would always ask is, let's say it's an invoicing, they're doing a bunch of invoicing, they're not getting their invoices out fast enough. I'd be like, why don't you just hire two more people to do the invoices the old way? It's much safer. It's
Mhm.
very risky and time consuming to do a software project. I can't just do it on my own. It's going to be a collaboration. It's going to be annoying. Like it's going to be annoying for 6 months probably.
Yeah.
So, right. So why bother? Just hire two more people. And they would say, we could do that, but we don't have enough room in the office, or we're planning to 10x the business and we can't hire 10 new employees. So now all of a sudden, I know, let's say the two employees fully loaded costs are like $60,000 a year, $65,000 a year.
Mhm.
And they would do that except for some other reason. Well, I know that this is definitely worth $130,000 to them.
Got
So
it.
you can kind of, or if they're planning to 10x the business and this is going to be the foundation for them to like grow over the course of the next 3 years, maybe 10x is exaggeration, but it doesn't matter. Whatever the reason is that they wouldn't do the cheaper, easier, safer thing, I need that information. And by asking for it, I can convince myself that it's worth me working with them. I can convince myself that I'm actually confident that it's a needle that I can move, and I get this really, really compelling story that I can just put in a couple of sentences with math and everything right into the situation appraisal in the eventual proposal that I'm going to write.
Got it.
So that it is so convincing, because they said it, not me, that they could show it to anybody and say, does this proposal make sense?
Mhm.
And just a normal person, a normal adult would be able to read it and see, like, this is a no-brainer. Like, do you trust the person to do the thing? Yeah, we trust the person. Okay, well, it's a
Mhm.
no-brainer. I mean, like, if this works even a little bit,
Right.
you're going to come out way ahead. So, so that's the thing. Uncovering that story, and hey, it takes practice. I did not become great at this on day one or day two or month 10. It took me a while to stop thinking about scope in the sales meeting because that was what I used to do. I used to think, all right, how many screens am I going to have to build? How many tables in the database? How many fields in the table? How much business logic? How complicated is this going to be? How complicated is this going to be? How long is it going to take me? How long is it going to take me? And that habit is really hard to break.
Mhm.
So you're kind of like solving the problem and you're imagining the solution that you're going to build while they're still talking to you in the sales meeting. And I know this is really common with software developers. They're kind of trying to design the solution in their head, but it's way too soon for that. You haven't even determined how much value there is for the client. So you shouldn't
Mhm.
even think about the scope. Even the stuff they say they want you to do, they're not the expert. They could be wrong. It might not be the easiest, cheapest way for them to get what they want. So you take that stuff down and everything, but you keep an open mind about what you're actually going to do say in the proposal, and find out what is the needle they're trying to move, what's the underlying motivation, and what's the potential value of that. Then you come up with some prices, and then you decide what you'd offer to do at each one of those prices. So you
Mhm.
reverse engineer the scope from the value.
Got it. Well, and it occurs to me that the one of the key reasons why agencies see churn in client relationships is lack of alignment with the work with the actual business goals of
Hmm.
the client. And that is either because, in my experience, seeing these deals go by the wayside, um, because you didn't have a hard enough conversation at the beginning with the prospect, or you didn't have a conversation with the right people making on the decision
Hmm.
making team on the client side, or whatever. But it's 6 months later, 9 months later, you've got a lot of data, and the data is healthy, but it's the wrong data, or it proves the wrong point, or it doesn't move the puck towards the goal that the client actually had and that you didn't suss out. So since we see churn and client relationships sever for this reason, the conversations you're describing are not only a way, it seems to me, to establish value really well, but a way to avoid the disappointment that's going to make you have to do this all over again really
Yep.
soon, sooner than you hoped for the next client opportunity, right?
Yes, one of my favorite things of taking a value-based approach for projects is it forces you to ask the client what is going to satisfy them so that
Hmm.
you have a shot at doing so. Back when we were hourly, when I worked at the hourly place, we never asked that. We always just asked like, how many tables, how many, like I said before, scope, scope, scope. How much stuff do you want me to do? I think it'll take me 100 hours. Whoops, it turned out it took 200 hours. And then you bring it to your project contact or whoever you've been working with, and they show it to the boss, and the boss flips their lid because this isn't going to do what we needed.
Oops.
I've
Yeah.
seen this. I've seen people get fired over this. I've seen lawsuits from it.
Yeah.
And
Well, in marketing too, for sure.
yeah, so why not, if you want to satisfy your clients, why not find out upfront what will satisfy the person sitting across the table from you? Why
Hmm.
not help them uncover what it is? They won't be able to just blurt it out,
Hmm.
but you can help them uncover it. And these are B2B sales. We're not talking about selling handbags. So
Right.
this person is trying to either increase revenue or decrease costs or something like that. And the thing that you're being hired to do, they believe will contribute to that downstream goal, or they wouldn't be wasting their time talking to you.
Hmm.
So in their mind, guaranteed, in their mind, there is something that you can do that they think will increase their bottom line.
Hmm.
So you need to find out what that is so you can take that story and put it in your proposal and make it a no-brainer.
Yeah, and you have to ask enough of the right questions of the right people. There's are multiple variables here, to make
Important,
sure you're
yes.
getting the data that you need to to price yourself fairly and extract enough value and extract the profit that you need to service the client. Speaking of which, I want to pull
Hmm.
out a thread of of yours from a couple of moments ago, and that's regarding scope. You mentioned
Hmm.
scope at a couple points, and it seems to me, again, from the outside looking in, that a big part of the mindset around how we price, what our business models are, is that scope creeps. It creeps all the time in the agency
Hmm.
space. And every time it does, your margin whittles away more and more. And the margins are not large in a lot of cases to begin with. That's a separate problem for lots of
Yeah,
reasons, of course. But what are your thoughts on how do you advocate an approach that creates some bandwidth to accommodate scope creep, or how do how should business developers and agencies think about addressing potential for scope creep and factoring it into how they value their work when they're pricing it out?
sure. Yeah, there's a couple things here. So first, I'm going to loop back to that idea of scope last, scoping last instead of scoping first. So if you start
Mhm.
with scoping last, and the value is maybe, let's just for round numbers say the value is somewhere in the ballpark of $100,000 for this client.
Mhm.
They're not going to pay you the full value. That's what it's worth to them, but they
Right.
want to feel like it was a positive investment, not an even trade.
Yeah,
So I would say start with 10%, 22%, and 50% of whatever the value is. As a rule of thumb, it's not a hard rule. I would advocate doing, if you're going to do a project proposal, I would say give them three options.
got it.
So it's not an ultimatum. They can compare option to option instead of you to the competition. Say, okay, if this is roughly in the ballpark of $100,000 worth of value to this client in the first year after the project launches, then I'm going to start at $10,000. And I know I can help them at least 10%. They believe that I can help them at least 10%, or they wouldn't have spent time on the phone talking to me. That would have been a waste of their time.
Mhm.
So it's like these are fuzzy numbers, but it gets you in the ballpark. So then I say to myself, all right, the needle that they want to move is, I don't know, they want to increase their throughput on invoicing by 20% so that they, decrease the time uh, decrease the time to get invoices out the door by 3 days, whatever it is. Okay, great. So what can I do for $10,000? In fact, what would I be fist pumpingly happy to do for $10,000 that will get them a little bit closer to that goal? Maybe not all the way. Maybe there are other people that have to pick up the ball after I'm done. to, I don't know, get the servers installed or whatever, train the employees, depends, right? I might not be able to single-handedly move that needle, but I'm
Right.
only asking for $10,000 and they stand to benefit 100,000. So I'm basically helping them a little bit. That's the option one. And
Got it.
you scope, once you look at that $10,000 and you think, I would be over the moon to get $10,000 to do A, B, and C.
Hmm.
Because I know the scope's going to creep. I know there are going to be surprises. There's always something, right?
Hmm.
So, yes, am I taking the risk that the scope might be a little bit bigger than I expected? Yes, I am. But that's also where the reward comes from.
Hmm.
So, I am taking some risk there, which in hourly, all that risk is put on the client. You have no incentive to
Right.
control scope creep when you're billing by the hour. It's good for you, actually, when the scope creeps. Other than the relationship damage, financially, it's good for you.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this model, are you taking some risk? Yes. But are you getting a reward? Yes. 100% margin. Put $5,000 worth of scope in your mind. Like, oh, I would do this for 5,000. I wouldn't be happy about it, but I would do it for 5,000. But you're pricing it at 10,000,
Hmm.
knowing that there's going to be some surprises. And when they eventually happen, you're fine. It's like no big deal.
Got it.
So
Okay.
that's one piece. You do that at each level. You scope like so you have plenty of headroom inside of there. You're like, I would basically want to fire myself if I couldn't do this for $22,000. Like I would not know what I was doing and I should be punished financially for failing to do this thing.
Punishment is a great motivator. I love it. Okay.
Well, right. I mean, we're supposedly experts and we supposedly know what we're doing and we
Agreed. Agreed.
supposedly can, I
Yep.
wouldn't recommend this for newbies necessarily. It's more like a thing that you've been doing this 5 years, 10 years. You've had a ton of client experience. You know what red flags look like. You've got experience.
Hmm.
So you can rely on that in this model. So there's another important thing. So first is scope. Scope last is my first point.
Got it.
Give yourself a lot of wiggle room because it will creep.
Hmm.
The other thing is now that the project has a goal, there's a desired outcome. It gives you leverage to defend the project. So what does that mean? So if the client comes to you, classic example is I'd be in there doing something on the website, like optimizing it for mobile or something like that 10 years ago. And
Hmm.
they're optimizing the website so that they can get more transactions, successful transactions on mobile. And the project contact comes to me and says, "Oh, the VP of sales, while you're in there, he was asking if you could just put a carousel on the homepage that does like this some fancy thing." And I'd be like, "What? Why would they want that?" Well,
Hmm.
the competitors have it and it looks really cool and it's this thing. And I'm like, "Well, our stated goal here is to decrease cart abandonment rate on mobile, right?" Right. Okay. And remember in the proposal and in the sales meeting, I told you I was going to defend the success of the project at all costs, and that might include telling you no about things that won't contribute to that outcome.
Hmm.
Yes, I remember that. Okay, well, how will this carousel on the homepage contribute to the entire team's stated goal and the boss is all bought in on decreasing cart abandonment rates on mobile? Well, it won't. Okay, so let's park that. And then once we declare victory on the stated goal of this project, we can take everything from the parking lot and say, like, okay, do we want to do another project to beautify the homepage or increase traffic or SEO or some other thing?
Right.
I'm not saying, no, I don't want to do that because it's more work for me. What I am saying is I can't do that without jeopardizing the goal that we have in front of us. So
Hmm.
you're keeping them laser focused on the goal.
Right.
The flip side of this is that every once in a while, they'll have an idea that will contribute to the stated outcome that you didn't think of.
Hmm.
And then what are you going to want to do? Even though it's scope creep, you're still going to want to do it because it's
Right.
still going to get you there as fast as it's even though you already did some work and maybe you have to throw it away, this new way is better. You're going to want to do that instead because it still maximizes your profits because it still gets you done faster than you would have if you went down the wrong road farther.
Got it. So what I like about that is that again, you are you're leaving the client in control of expressing their priorities without dictating, without turning the agency into an order taker and
Yep.
dictating the means by which the goal is accomplished, which is inevitably going to crash into the margins of the project for the agency.
Hmm.
And you're still you're being an accountability partner,
Hmm.
not an order taker to the client so that the business goals they expressed are actually achievable and achieved. And look, maybe their goals mid-project have had to change because of some third-party circumstance, or maybe there's been a change of heart within the client organization. Well, then you have to, have a summit and figure out what you're all
Yeah.
going to do about that and what it means for the work and maybe have another pricing conversation, right?
Yes. So it's very rare for that to happen. People think
Yeah,
it happens more than because people are used to a lot of scope creep and clients changing their mind, but it's because they're paying for your time. And so they're just like, and there's no stated goal. There might be a goal in their minds. There might be a different goal in your minds. And they're just used to it and they just yank you all over the place. And then they get angry when they realize they've blown a whole bunch of money. In this model, it doesn't happen like that almost ever because something like, we want to get invoices out 3 days faster. Why would they change their mind about that? They're not going to.
right.
And, to a certain extent, you're going to want to get a get a degree of confidence in the meeting that they're not going to suddenly change their mind about their business goal. The thing that they changed their mind about back when I was billing hourly is how you do it,
Mm,
not the goal. They'll say, like, you know what? I'm not liking the direction of this design. Let's start over and do a different design. The goal
mhm.
hasn't changed. They're just micromanaging you because
Yeah.
there's been no agreed upon goal. So once you
Mhm.
have that goal, it's pretty rare that people, especially if it's a valuable one, it's pretty rare that it's gonna go sideways and they're gonna change their mind. But it does happen sometimes.
Mhm.
Like your project contact gets fired, or there's a shakeup at the very top of the organization, and there's just like a massive strategic change, and like everything just stops.
Right.
Or something does happen and it changes the priority of something that was farther down a different project. They're like, that has to come to the top. And maybe
Yeah.
you're not even involved with that other project,
Yeah.
but that, whatever. So these things can happen, but they're very rare. And in a
Mhm.
case where it does happen, depends on the situation. But
Yeah.
I've had all of those things happen to me, and there are ways to, you don't get killed. You don't get killed. It's not the
Yeah.
end of
Well,
the
I mean,
world.
it is a very real, in marketing land, the average tenure of a CMO or a decision maker on, choosing marketing agency partners
Hmm.
has continued to shrink and shrink. And so that can happen, right? There's a new regime, they want to bring their own team into place, and that is just a risk of being in this industry. And you can't build a business on the fear of that happening, right?
Oh, it'll happen, right? At
Yeah,
some
I'm
point, something
yeah,
will happen. Yes.
yeah. So everything you're sharing leads me to the conclusion, and I want to run this by you and see if I'm thinking about this correctly. Leads me to the conclusion that it's easier is a value judgment. It's implementing value-based business models works better if you have a very well-defined value proposition yourself or lane of expertise, a
Hmm.
niche, an industry vertical that you serve really well, a
Hmm.
horizontal expertise that you are,
Yeah.
you know, do you agree with that? Do you find that to be true with the clients that you coach on all of this?
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, because if there's not a meaningful difference between you and someone who's half your price, then the only meaningful difference that the client can recognize is the price.
Yeah,
I mean, if they're looking at two apples and one of them is $1 and one of them is 50 cents, probably going to go with the cheaper one.
yeah.
So you cannot be apples to apples. You cannot let people compare you apples to apples against whatever air quotes your competitors are. You
Mhm.
want to turn yourself into a monopoly so that almost always, I can't even imagine a way that that would come from being more general. You need to be more specialized at something. And you
Mhm.
actually, that was a great list that you just rattled off of the different ways that you can do it. There are
Mhm.
lots of different dimensions where you can be the one and only for a very specific thing. And maybe the total addressable market for that thing is 5,000 clients worldwide.
Mhm.
Well, if you're a soloist like me, that's way too many. I could never, ever handle 5,000 clients.
Right. No small agency or mid-sized agency could either, at least to any degree. Yeah, I mean, any degree of credibility. So,
Right.
yeah, same.
Right. And so the pushback I always get on this is because it's critical. You have to be different. You have to stand out from the rest of the options. The pushback I get is they say, well, why would I, I want to cast a wide net. And I'm like, that's the wrong metaphor. The net is not the size of the market. The water is the size of the market. So if you pick the net is your marketing budget. So Nike has a net, Apple has a net, Samsung has a net.
Mm.
You've got a measly little fishing hook. That's it.
That's true.
So yes, the ocean has something like 3.5 trillion fish in it. But do you want to go out in a dinghy with your little fishing hook and try and catch fish out there? All different kinds of fish with
Mm.
just your one piece of bait that you have? Or would you rather be standing next to a 55-gallon drum stock full of trout that are practically jumping into your basket,
Mm.
even though there's only a couple hundred in there? It's way better to be in the trout barrel than the ocean.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole premise of blue ocean strategy, right? Is
Yes,
it
exactly. Hmm.
you fish and swim where you've got the most space to do it and where nobody else is, creating
Yeah.
a mess or bleeding around you.
Yeah. Drucker talks about it too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not new. This is not new.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you're already pretty specialized. If you like, it's just that so many other people are also doing it. You have to be different. This is the key word, in a meaningful way to your buyers, not in a way that you just know you're better than the other people down the street, or you just
Right.
know that, you've got more awards or whatever. If the client doesn't care, if your ideal buyer doesn't care about awards or they don't know, the internal workings of like who thinks they're better in the peer group of your competitors, they don't know
Mm.
that. And
Mm.
they're not experts at what you do. They can't just look at something and know you're better than the next guy.
Mhm.
So if they can't tell, there's only one thing left, and it's a really clear signal, and it's your price.
Mm.
And if you've given them no other reason, if you give them no way to justify your premium fees, they are not going to pay them.
Mm. So if you're an agency leader and you have jumped on the train with Jonathan and Sharon, because I believe everything you're saying, um, what are some of the what are some of the low-hanging fruit first steps that you think agencies can take to walk along this pathway to getting their pricing to be more about value and less
Mhm.
about the amount of time that it's taking them to deliver what they deliver? What are a couple
Yeah,
of the first things they should be thinking about doing or thinking?
sure. So you didn't say this, but I want to say it out loud in case someone's thinking it. Value-based pricing is not a business model. It's a pricing model. It's a pricing approach,
Right.
and it mixes perfectly well with other approaches to pricing. Cost plus, time and material. Well, not time and materials. That's hourly,
Yeah.
but it mixes with other approaches. And whatever fixed price is fine. So a couple of things I would do to get started. Probably the first thing I would do to get started is create a productized service that is an entry point into sort of the Trojan horse. If you, I hate to use like war metaphors and fishing metaphors and stuff, but because really what we're trying to do is make the client's business better. I'm not trying to eat
Right.
it, but
Yeah. We're not going to war with the clients.
we're
We're
not
helping
going to
the
war with the
client.
clients. But those are the
Got it.
metaphors. Okay, so if you create a productized service and you take a service that you already do, you probably do it. It's probably the first week or so that you do with every new client when you onboard them. There's probably
Mhm.
this process that your team goes through to kind of get everybody on the same page and like understand the big picture. And maybe you're going to do, maybe it's the branding stuff that you do at the beginning or positioning thing or some high level strategic thing where all of the highest level people from the client are going to be involved right at the beginning. And then you set about doing your execution work, your implementation work, all of the things after you've got your direction and everybody's agreed on the direction. That thing at the beginning, it probably happens the same process pretty much every time if you've been in business for a while.
Mhm.
Just break that piece off and turn that into just come up with some name for it, but it's basically a roadmap. You're going to create a roadmap and just set a price for it. I can't tell an anonymous group of people what price to set, but
Right.
usually, depending on the size of the agency, I've seen it as high as like $65,000. I've seen it as low as 1,000.
Got it.
But a
Okay.
lot of times it's in the low to mid four-figure range. But it completely depends on who your clients are. If you have huge,
Right.
if you're selling to like Procter and Gamble, you're probably closer to the $50,000,
Right.
$65,000 range. It really depends. But your goal here is to set a price that's not too low to make you look cheap and not like you don't know what you're doing, but not so high that they have to get approval and think about it. You want it to be like kind of a no-brainer price that is high enough, but not too high, so that you can publish it on your website, describe what the whole benefit of this thing is, and then probably talk about some of the mechanics of it so that someone as you're getting traffic to your website or people are referring you, they can see this thing. And it's called a productized service because it's marketed and sold like a product, like a
Hmm.
bottle of aspirin that has the benefits on the front, the ingredients on the back, and a price on the shelf. So they can look at it. The pricing signal is super strong. I am a big fan. Some people don't, some people are called for price. I'm a huge fan of putting the price on the thing on the website because it sends
Interesting.
such
Okay.
a powerful signal about the value of the thing.
Okay.
So if the right person comes along, they're going to get this much value out of it
Got
or,
it.
or more. I mean, it'll be worth at least what they paid for. It'll be worth even more than that. So that is the first thing I would do is some people will describe it as a paid diagnostic or some kind of audit or a prioritized
Discovery.
roadmap,
Yeah.
discovery, right? The word will depend on who your market is. Some people will recoil at the mention of the word audit for financial reasons. Other people will just have just decided they don't pay for discovery. That's part of the job. You have to do discovery for free to write the proposal. And so
I have received both those pushbacks in,
yeah,
in my professional services sales career. Yes.
right. So you need
Yeah.
to make it clear that the report that they're going to get has business value unto itself, even if they don't work with you after the report is done.
Hmm.
So it basically what it's going to end up being is a roadmap of some kind, whatever you call it, that says here are the things that we uncovered. These are our findings. And based on my expertise in this space, I would recommend that you do these things, do them in this order. These are the low hanging fruit at the top. Those are the greens, like definitely do all the greens. Won't take that long. Big bang for the buck. Some middle stuff. It's like maybe it's not going to pay off immediately, but it's pretty easy to do. So you might as well try it. And then there's some nice to haves that could take a lot of work, but aren't they're just not critical. Could take a lot of work. Sort of more of an optimization than anything else.
Got
That
it.
is super valuable to an executive. If they don't know the space that you're in, I don't know, they manufacture wire and they need some software system. They don't know anything about software, but they have all these ideas of what they think they need. And
Hmm.
then when they get a list like this, all of a sudden they're like, wow, that first thing we don't even need to hire someone to do. We can
Hmm.
just start documenting the process and create a three-ring binder and pass that out to all the employees. And we don't even need software for that.
Right.
So it's extraordinarily valuable to that in situations like that. So
Yeah.
and again, you're probably already doing this.
Right.
It's probably something you've
Well,
been
and you
doing for
have
a
to
long
do it to
time.
sell to them anyway. I mean, it's just prep work for most sales processes in the first place. So, right.
Right. Yeah, that opens up another whole can of worms. But for me, a sales process and this value pricing model, which is the most complicated pricing model, I think the most sophisticated pricing model, it requires the most soft skill and understanding of human psychology and a lot of business acumen. I wouldn't spend more than an hour on the phone with someone to do. That's it. If I'm not convinced that I should write a proposal after an hour, I shouldn't write a proposal. So, but yes, so for people to take the first step, I would look at my process for a new client project. What's the thing that we always do? What should we call it? And what is the direct immediate value that the client gets at the end of that meeting? And usually it's clarity about how to deploy their resources more profitably.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And then at the end of that, if the client's super happy, you feel like you did a good job, you're really happy with the client, you get a testimonial or whatever, and they say, all right, great. Now can you help us implement it? And you can say yes or no for whatever reason. And if you do say yes, And then I would write one of these proposals with three options. There's three ways we can do this. We can take off this chunk of the roadmap, the entire thing of the roadmap. We can be thinking 10-year roadmap, or we can think a 2-year roadmap. And
Mhm.
you just give a value-based proposal. And at that point, it'll be easy because you'll have been inside their business,
Right.
and you're not trying to gouge them or anything. It's like you're just going to a fraction of what it's worth to them, so that you've got a nice margin and they have a really nice margin. Everybody's happy.
Hmm. Got it. This has been so instructive just for me individually as the owner of a professional services business, but I think for agencies right now who are trying to figure out the best ways to move forward when their margins were already challenged.
Hmm.
Um, uh, this past year, 2025, has brought a lot of different technology and economic challenges to the industry. So that's not
Hmm.
helping. So I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you a last question that had the
Sure.
letters A and I in it. And so, what kind of question or questions are you getting from your clients about um, the impact of AI on pricing models? And I guess I'll ask this angle on it specifically in terms of client expectations that prices should be lower because
Hmm.
you're going to use AI, right? And that's going to make it faster, cheaper, etc.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna, express a value judgment about the correctness of that presumption, but it's happening. I mean, these conversations and these expectations are occurring. So,
Sure.
what do you tell the service firm owner about how to respond to that or how they should be thinking about the impact of AI on their pricing?
Right. So when I first started playing around with AI, I was like, oh, this is great because it's going to accelerate the demise of the billable hour, because it's going to make, especially because professional services has been immune to a lot of productivity gains from software automation and physical automation and
Yeah.
stuff like that. And I was like, oh, wow. So this is going to have an effect. If you're in the business of selling deliverables, especially digital deliverables, if that's the way you're presenting yourself, you're in trouble,
Mm.
because they're gonna. I mean, I've had people be like, "I can do that myself. Why would I even hire anyone?" Right?
Mhm.
And they might be incorrect about the effectiveness of the thing that they think they can do. I had a conversation with someone the other night, a coder, and his client has been vibe coding. I don't know if you've heard that term. Has been
Oh
vibe
yeah.
coding stuff. The person is not technical, and they are going. If I was going to make a prediction, I would say they're going to ruin their entire code base. It's going to be a hot mess. But to your point, the client doesn't know that because they're so inexperienced that they don't even know what a hot mess looks like in a code base.
Yep.
So, okay, so that's going to happen. So, what do you do about it? Nothing different from what I already described. AI has zero effect on this because
Got
the
it.
the result is worth something to the client. These are B2B sales. The result is worth something. It's going to contribute the final the final success metric, the desired outcome is worth something to them. That value is not going to change because I have AI.
Mhm.
That's what it's worth to them. Now, when I set my three prices, let's just stick with 10,000. When I'm doing that thing where I say, what could I do for $10,000 that I'd be fist pumpingly happy to do? I can probably do a lot more than I used to be able to do.
Mhm.
So so when they see that option on the proposal, they're going to say, wow, this is a lot of stuff for $10,000 that's going to get us down the road closer to that $100,000 benefit that we want. So any improvement of your tooling or boilerplate or any efficiency that you create for yourself automatically works in this model. So you'll just appear more competitive. So maybe ultimately you personally do the same amount of work that you would have done without AI, you do with AI, but now the thing that you've produced is maybe twice as good. Let's just assume that AI does turn out to be a net positive in terms of
Mhm.
productivity. So you just put more scope in because AI is going to do half of it for you. So like, okay, great.
Mhm.
So it just has no effect on any of this. The other thing you could do is say, I'm basically they're gonna feel like they're getting the same thing, but my prices can be way lower because I'd be fist pumpingly happy for $500 because this is going to take me 13 minutes. And I've already got all the stuff set up. I've got the project in ChatGPT. I just run it through there
Hmm.
and produces some output. That's
Hmm.
probably an exaggeration that anybody would get down there, but
Right.
like that low from a $10,000 point down to like 500.
Right.
But
No, but I
it just
take your point.
automatically works. Any efficiency, automation, it all just automatically flows into this model as long as you're selling the results and not the deliverables, and
I can't
certainly
think
not the time.
I cannot think of a better mic drop place to end this conversation, Jonathan. I have to say this is I think this inspires me because, we've at my firm moved in this direction a while ago, and this just gives me some ideas about how to enhance what we're already doing. But this is a conversation I think agency owners need to hear because they need the proof points and they need the credible arguments to actually be brave enough to do this. And it does feel like bravery to a lot of them, I
Mm,
can tell you, because of the reasons we talked about a while ago. But where can people learn more about your body of work, the coaching and consulting you do? I would highly recommend Jonathan's YouTube channel, by the way, to
oh,
all of
good.
you. And I don't drop those very often on the show, but I certainly went down a rabbit hole when I started watching, especially the shorts. That's a good way to get started.
Mhm.
But talk a little bit about how people can find you, your book, and learn more about your work.
The best way is to jump on my mailing list, which is it starts off with a free 6 day course about value pricing, goes into more detail, maybe be easier to consume in a text format.
Mhm.
So it's sort of broken up into bite-sized pieces. It takes 6 days to roll out, and they all come from my personal email address. So you can reply to anything with questions. It goes right to my inbox. I don't have any employees. So I get all the email, I respond to all of those. So that's the best way. So if you go to valuepricingbootcamp.com, it redirects you to my page at my website where you can sign up for that. And then I do a daily email. After that's done, then if you want to stay on the list, you get a daily email that I write every day, just a little tip or trick or insight or way to think about this idea of pricing in a way that is not intuitive for some reason.
Yeah, no, agreed. Well, we'll drop those links definitely in the show notes. And uh, your book is called Hourly Pricing is
Billing,
Nuts. Hourly Billing is
hourly billing
Nuts.
is
Yeah,
nuts.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I'm looking forward to digging into that too. Just ordered that, by the way. So,
Great.
um, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I think everyone else listening will have great takeaways as well. And thanks the rest of you for joining us for another episode. Great to have you here with us again. And until we all meet again, everybody stay well. Take care.